Part 1. The Black Death arrives, uninvited, as always. Hey guys, tonight let's do something gentle. Let's dim the lights a little. Maybe put your phone face down. Get comfortable. No big emotions, no jump scares. Just one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, told very slowly and very calmly. This is the story of the Black Death, the plague that quietly walked into medieval life, sat down uninvited, and rearranged absolutely everything: economics, religion, politics, family life, and yes, a lot of very confident kings who were sure God was on their side, until suddenly they weren't feeling so great. So take a breath, settle in, and let's drift back to a world where nobody washed their hands, rats were roommates, and medicine was basically vibes. Now, before we even get into Europe panicking itself into a collective meltdown, we should rewind a bit, because the Black Death did not start in Europe. Europe just noticed it loudly. Most historians agree the plague began somewhere in Central or East Asia, possibly in the steppes, possibly in China, somewhere with trade routes, animals, and humans all sharing space, food, and fleas, which historically is never a great combo. The bacterium responsible, Yersinia pestis, lived inside fleas. The fleas lived on rodents. The rodents lived everywhere. And humans, being humans, lived right next to them, stored grain with them, and occasionally ate them when times were rough, which they often were. For a long time, the plague stayed local, small outbreaks, nothing that made the global history books. But then came trade, and empires, and the Mongols. Now, the Mongol Empire was very impressive. Huge territory, fast horses, excellent logistics. Unfortunately, also excellent at moving diseases around very efficiently. By the early 1300s, trade routes like the Silk Road connected Asia to the Middle East and Europe. Spices moved, silk moved, gold moved, and quietly, so did fleas. There's a famous story from the Crimean city of Kaffa. The Mongols were besieging it. They started dying of plague, and allegedly, because medieval warfare had no chill, they catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, which is ambitious and horrifying, and very on brand for the era. Whether or not that exact detail happened, the plague definitely entered Mediterranean trade ports soon after. Ships left the Black Sea. Ships arrived in places like Messina, Genoa, and Venice, and when they docked, sailors stumbled off looking not amazing. By 1347, the Black Death had officially arrived in Europe, and Europe was not ready at all. Medieval Europe was crowded, cities were packed, houses leaned into each other like they were sharing secrets, animals lived indoors, waste was dumped in the streets, and the general understanding of disease was, let's call it, symbolic. People believed illness came from bad air, or divine punishment, or sinful thoughts, or the planets being in a bad mood, which, to be fair, they kind of were. Doctors wore long robes and bird beak masks filled with herbs, not because it worked, but because it made them feel professional. And confidence is important when you have absolutely no idea what's happening. The symptoms of the plague were not subtle: fever, chills, vomiting, and then the bugos, painful, swollen lymph nodes that appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck. They turned black, they oozed, they smelled terrible, and they were usually followed by death within days. Hence the name, the Black Death. Very literal, very on the nose. People died fast, sometimes within 48 hours, sometimes overnight. Healthy in the morning, gone by morning prayers. And because this is medieval Europe, everyone immediately assumed God was furious. Church bells rang constantly, mass graves were dug, priests walked from house to house until they too collapsed. Funerals became group events, then rushed events, then optional events. In some cities, carts rolled through the streets collecting bodies. People tossed out their dead relatives like unwanted furniture, not out of cruelty, out of survival. Families locked themselves inside homes or fled into the countryside, which sometimes helped and sometimes just spread the plague faster because fleas do not respect your travel plans. Royal courts panicked too. Kings fled cities, queens isolated themselves in castles, nobles rotated residences constantly, convinced the disease couldn't keep up. Spoiler alert, it could. King Philip VI of France tried prayer, then processions, then banning games and prostitution, because obviously the plague cared deeply about moral behavior. In England, King Edward III shut down Parliament. Courts stopped meeting, trade slowed, fields went unharvested, which caused food shortages, which made everyone weaker, which helped the plague. A beautiful little feedback loop. Meanwhile, doctors prescribed things like bloodletting, or lancing buboes, or holding crushed emeralds against the skin, which did nothing, except maybe give people something to focus on while they died. Some people turned to extreme religion. Enter the flagellants, groups of men who marched from town to town, whipping themselves, apologizing to God very loudly. They believed suffering would end the plague. It did not, but it did make the streets more crowded, which again helped the plague. Others looked for someone to blame, and sadly, very predictably, Jewish communities were targeted, accused of poisoning wells or summoning the disease or existing incorrectly. Thousands were killed or expelled. The plague continued anyway, unbothered, unimpressed. By 1351, the Black Death had killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. No one knows the exact number, because record-keeping was not a priority during mass death. But it was enormous. Villages vanished. Entire bloodlines ended. Jobs went unfilled. Land sat unused. And here's where things get weirdly ironic. The survivors suddenly had power. With so many dead, labor became valuable. Peasants demanded higher wages, serfs left estates, feudal systems cracked. Kings passed laws trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. Workers ignored them because there were fewer people to enforce anything. The church lost authority too. Prayers hadn't stopped the plague. Relics hadn't helped. Clergy died just as fast as everyone else. People started questioning things, quietly, sleepily, but persistently. Art changed. Suddenly, it was all skeletons and hourglasses and grim reminders that life was short. Very subtle messaging. Medicine slowly shifted. Observation mattered more than ancient texts. Doctors began noticing patterns, not understanding them yet, but noticing. And through it all, the plague never fully left. It came back in waves, for centuries, less dramatic each time, but always there, like an unwanted sequel nobody asked for. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it reshaped how humans thought about life, death, work, faith, and authority. It humbled emperors, it erased dynasties, it made survival feel temporary. And all of this happened quietly, without speeches, without villains monologuing, just fleas, rats, and humans doing what they do best, living too close together and pretending nothing bad will happen. And as we float forward, we'll start looking closer at the kings who ran, the queens who prayed, the children born into a world that felt suddenly fragile. So let's float forward, past the mass graves, past the empty streets, and into the strange, exhausted aftermath of a world forever changed. All right, welcome back. If you drifted off a little, that's perfect. That means we're doing this correctly. Last time, we watched the Black Death stroll into Europe like it owned the place. Cities collapsed, bells rang until nobody was left to ring them, and the social order started quietly sweating. So now, let's gently zoom in. Not on the masses this time, but on the people who were absolutely certain this whole plague thing would not apply to them, because tonight we're talking about royalty. Now, medieval kings believed deeply in a concept known as divine right, which is a fancy way of saying, God picked me personally, so statistically I should be fine. This belief worked great, right up until the plague showed up and treated kings exactly like peasants, which was very rude of it. When the Black Death began spreading, royal courts across Europe reacted with impressive speed, by which I mean they ran. Kings abandoned capitals, queens packed up jewels, courtiers followed, coughing politely behind silk sleeves. Castles and remote countrysides suddenly became very popular again. King Edward III of England is a good example. In 1348, when plague reached England through port cities, Edward did not hesitate. He cancelled Parliament, shut down courts, and retreated into the countryside. This wasn't cowardice, this was strategy, because if you don't die, you technically win. The royal household scattered across multiple residences. They avoided cities, they limited visitors, they rotated locations like the plague was a bad dinner guest that might show up unexpectedly. And, to be fair, this worked, sometimes. Edward survived. So did his queen, Philippa of Hainaut, but many nobles did not. Entire aristocratic families vanished between seasons. Heirs died before inheriting. Estates reverted to the crown, which awkwardly made kings richer while their populations shrank. In France, King Philip VI tried a different approach. He stayed closer to Paris, he organized prayers, he issued religious proclamations, and when that didn't help, he also eventually fled, because prayer plus distance is better than prayer alone. Royal doctors did their best, which again was mostly guessing. They advised avoiding baths because opening pores was apparently dangerous. They warned against sex, strong emotions, and thinking too hard, which sounds suspiciously like they were just tired. Some monarchs believed the plague was punishment for sin. Others believed it was astrology. A rare few suspected it might be contagious, but without microscopes, the flea theory remained tragically unavailable. Meanwhile, inside castles, life became tense. Servants disappeared, cooks died, stable hands vanished. Suddenly, nobles had to do things themselves, which they hated. Imagine a duke realizing he has no one to lace his shoes, truly devastating. Royal children were especially vulnerable. They lived in close quarters, they were handled constantly, they had weaker immune systems, and when they died, succession crises followed. In Spain, Alfonso XI of Castile caught the plague while besieging Gibraltar. He refused to retreat. He believed abandoning a siege would make him look weak, which is a very medieval way to die. He became the only reigning monarch known to have died of the Black Death, which is both tragic and impressively stubborn. His death destabilized the kingdom, because nothing says bad timing like dying mid-war during a pandemic. Queens often fared better than expected, not because they were immune, but because they were more likely to isolate, to limit contact, to move households quietly. Still, many died, including Joan of Navarre, Queen of France, and several royal mistresses, which made succession messy and gossip plentiful. The plague did something else, too. It shortened childhood. Royal children were married younger, crowned earlier, expected to rule sooner, because life expectancy had suddenly become more of a suggestion. And this pressure created interesting adults. But while kings and queens hid behind stone walls, outside those walls, the world was changing. With labor shortages everywhere, surviving peasants demanded better treatment, and shockingly, they got it. In England, wages rose, landlords panicked. The Crown passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351. It tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It tried to force workers to stay put. Workers ignored it, because laws don't work very well when half the population is gone. Peasants moved freely. They chose employers. They negotiated. Feudal bonds weakened, and kings noticed. They were not thrilled. Royal authority began to feel thinner, still powerful but less unquestioned. The church felt this too. Priests had died in massive numbers. Many replacements were poorly trained, some openly corrupt. Faith didn't disappear, but trust did. People began practicing religion privately, personally, without intermediaries, which would become very important later. But let's not rush. We're still floating. Back in the castles, something else was happening. Grief. Kings lost friends. Queens lost children. Courtiers lost entire social circles. And because this is medieval royalty, they were not emotionally equipped for this. Some became deeply religious. Some withdrew. Some became paranoid. Some leaned into luxury harder than ever. Why not wear silk during a plague? You might die tomorrow. Court life became quieter. Fewer banquets, less music, more waiting. Royal chroniclers recorded eerie details, empty halls, unfinished projects, abandoned plans. Time felt unstable, and then slowly the plague eased. Not ended, just paused. Cities began to refill. Markets reopened. Children were born into a world where death was normal. Survivors remarried quickly because companionship mattered and loneliness was terrifying. Kings returned to capitals. They found changed populations, more assertive, less submissive, and they didn't love that. Attempts to reassert control often failed. Rebellions brewed quietly. Resentment simmered. The Black Death had done something irreversible. It had reminded everyone that authority was fragile, that God's favor was not exclusive, and that survival was sometimes random. And in that randomness, the seeds of a new world were planted. But before we get there, before we drift into renaissances and revolutions, we need to linger a little longer in the aftermath. Because the plague didn't just change governments, it changed minds and bodies and childhoods. So take another breath, let the centuries blur, and let's drift onward. All right, this is the last stretch. Nothing dramatic, no big finale, just a slow exhale after centuries of holding breath. If you're still awake, that's fine. If you're half dreaming, even better. History sounds nicest when it blurs a little. So now the plague has passed. Not gone forever, but quieter, like a storm that moved on, leaving things rearranged. The Black Death did something subtle and strange. It didn't end the medieval world overnight. It loosened it, like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long. People who survived carried scars, not always visible ones. They had watched parents die, children vanish, whole neighborhoods empty out. But medieval people did not write about trauma. They just lived with it. They married quickly. They worked hard. They laughed louder than before because silence reminded them of mass graves. Daily life slowly restarted. Fields were replanted, often by different families, sometimes by former serfs who now owned land, which would have sounded impossible a generation earlier. Towns rebuilt, but not exactly the same way. Houses were spaced slightly farther apart. Wells were watched more closely. Garbage was marginally less everywhere. Not clean, just less ambitious in its filth. Guilds gained power. Craftsmen negotiated better terms. Work mattered more than lineage, which annoyed nobles deeply. Kings tried to push back. They passed laws. They tightened taxes. They reminded everyone who was in charge. But the memory of the plague lingered. People knew kings could die. Priests could die. Everyone could die. That knowledge does things to obedience. Religion shifted gently, not away from belief, but away from blind trust. People prayed privately. They focused on personal salvation. They questioned why suffering existed, quietly, internally. Art reflected this mood. Paintings filled with skeletons, dancing death motifs, hourglasses, wilted flowers, all saying the same thing in different ways. You're not special. Time wins. Enjoy today. Medicine, too, changed slowly. Doctors began recording symptoms instead of just quoting ancient texts. They noticed patterns. They argued with each other, which is progress. Quarantine became a thing. Ports isolated ships. Cities created health boards. Venice invented isolation islands, because if you can't cure it, you can at least stall it. And this worked. Not perfectly, but better than prayer alone. The plague returned, again and again, but each time it was slightly less devastating. Populations rebounded. Immunity grew. Responses improved. And eventually, the Black Death faded into history. Not forgotten, just background. But the world it left behind was different. Feudalism weakened. Capitalism slowly took shape. Universities grew. Ideas traveled faster than armies. The Renaissance didn't happen because of the plague, but it couldn't have happened without it. Too many old structures had cracked. Too many certainties had died. Even royalty changed. Kings became more bureaucratic, less mystical. Power was justified through law and administration, not just divine favor. Queens gained influence behind the scenes. Widows managed estates. Women inherited more frequently due to lack of male heirs. Not equality, but movement. Children were still married young, but education mattered more. Survival favored adoptability. And far into the future, echoes remained. Public health systems, hospitals, medical licensing, all born from the memory of mass death. The idea that governments were responsible for health, that disease was a shared problem, that prevention mattered. These ideas began here, in fear, in loss, in quiet desperation. The Black Death didn't just change history, it slowed it, forced it to pause, and then nudged it onto a new path. And the strangest part? Most people who lived through it didn't know they were changing the world. They just knew they were tired and grieving and still alive, which at the time felt like enough. So as we drift out of the medieval night, past the empty villages that slowly filled again, past the kings who aged too fast, past the children born into a quieter, stranger world, we leave the Black Death where it belongs. Not as a monster, not as a lesson shouted loudly, but as a long, low note in human history, one that reshaped everything without ever asking permission.
And that's where we'll stop tonight. No cliffhanger, no moral, just the reminder that history moves forward, even when it's exhausted. So if your eyes are heavy now, that's perfect. Thanks for listening. Sleep well.